and welcome to our 5 minutes with Ekaterina Ukrainian history. Today let's talk about Orest Subtelny and his book called Ukraine, the History. We have already started reading it together and I read it in Ukrainian translation, so you might think that it is a book written by a Ukrainian person in Ukrainian language, but it is very far of being true. Orest Subtelny, who wrote this book, was born in 1941 in Poland, and only in 1960s he visited Ukraine for the first time, and he visited it several times. He participated in Ukrainian movements, youth movements, and he was very engaged into the culture and very interested in the history of Ukrainian people. When he was still young, he emigrated to Canada, where he would spend the rest of his life studying history in different institutions and working in the University of York in Canada. In 1988, he would publish his work, this exactly work, Ukraine, the History, in Toronto University Press. In one of his talks recorded on camera, Orest Subtelny said that Ukrainians think that it was difficult at these times, and let's remember that in 1988, Ukraine was still the part of a totalitarian Soviet Union, and the Ukrainian studies and the Ukrainian history, they were only a part of a propaganda, and the only idea which was the mainstream was that Ukrainians are the part of the fraternity, and they are not different in any way from Russians or Belarusians, for example. And as a historian, as a scientist, you cannot say anything which was in controversy with this statement. And that's why studying the Ukrainian history, it was extremely hard in Ukraine for Ukrainian scholars. But what he said is that it was the same abroad, and in Canada when he was doing his degrees and where he did his research, he also met an opposition, but from the different perspective, because they said, the opponents of this researchers said, why would you study the nation that doesn't exist? Why would you study the people that don't have their national identity, and they don't have their own state, and it's not perspective, it's useless to do it. And he had to fight with this opinion, and he had to do his job at the utmost level. He had to follow all the rules of historical studies in order to be approved and in order to gain his reputation and to gain his recognition in the scholars' circles. But let's go back to the book itself. I'm holding here the Russian translation of the book. It was made in Kyiv, and the book was published in 1994. This book was translated by two people, Vladimir Zvinyatkovsky and Georgy Kasyanov. And so this is the collective work, and from the translational point of view, it's very interesting because, as for me, the translation is very close and very good. And here in the foreword, on the very beginning, you can read that in Ukrainian, by the way, you can read that this is the book translated for those people who want to know the history of their country, the history of Ukraine, but who don't know Ukrainian language yet. And that shows that a couple of years after independence, the big number of Ukrainians and the big number of people who might be interested in the real history of Ukraine, they even didn't speak Ukrainian language. That's how big impact of Russian language, Russian culture, Russification during the Soviet times was. And I have the Russian version of the book just because I was able to buy it, because it's not very easy to buy it now in Ukraine, and this is the used book. It doesn't look great, but it's not my fault, or it's not the fault of anyone whom I know. It's just I was able to buy it in the Russian translation. But the one which we were reading together, it was the Ukrainian translation, and it was published online, so you have the access to it. Anyone can read it in Ukrainian language online. And it was translated by Yuri Shevchuk, and it was translated in 1992. That was the time when the Ukrainian grammar was still impacted a lot by these Russian influences. And the very crucial question of how would you say to Ukraine, or at the territory of Ukraine, on the territory of Ukraine, that was that wasn't a very sensitive question back then, but it became a very sensitive question. In the modern Ukrainian language, we almost never use na Україні, saying that on the territory of Ukraine. We would say na території України, meaning on the territory. But when we talk about Ukraine, we would say в Україні, meaning in Ukraine as a state. And this question, it became a very radicalized, which pronoun we should use here. And in the book I'm reading together with you, in this translation, everywhere is used na Ukraini, even when we mean that Ukraine is the territory of Ukraine. Maybe it is the meaning of the territories because Ukraine didn't exist, for example, in the Middle Ages or before that. But this kind of translation, this kind of writing, orthography, it's not up to date by now. And also, when we read the book itself, we can see some things towards which now the position is very different. And especially what strikes me a lot is that comparison of Ukrainians and Russians, of Ukraine and Russia. And this was made by Orest Subtelny to underline that Ukrainians are actually a separate nation, they have separate history, and that's actually some nation that exists and that deserves to have independence. That is something that is obvious now after 30 years of independence. This year we celebrated exactly 30 years of Ukrainians' independence. But back then, in 1988, it wasn't so straightforward, and it wasn't obvious at all. The state didn't exist. A lot of people spoke only Russian, and a lot of Ukrainians, they didn't realize that there would be any difference in the very near future, and that actually Ukraine will have literally national state in its current borders. And even now, it is not something that we take as it is, because we have a war, we have a military aggression, and this is something we have to prove more and more during the course of these 30 years. But it's very interesting how it started when there was this controversy, where Orest Subtelny is saying, no, Ukrainians are not like Russians because. And that's how Russians appeared in the book about the history of Ukraine. Also, I decided to read it in Ukrainian with you, not in English, because in English you can do it yourself. And this is a book which is very significant because all modern Ukrainian studies, they started taking this book as a starting point, because this perspective of looking at the history of Ukraine as a separate lens, as a separate Ukrainians as a separate people, it wasn't normal in the Soviet Union, and those scientists who were working before the independence, and they were still alive, and they made their career during the independence, they had to change their perspective somehow. And that was a very good idea to change it exactly the way Orest Subtelny offered. So when we look at the studies made in 90s almost all of them, they repeat and transform a little bit the very same ideas, and these root ideas you can find in the book Ukraine, the History. So that's why I wanted to read it together, and that's why I hope you will enjoy it and you will understand the perspective, that it is the perspective of more than 30 years ago. It is the perspective and it is the look from abroad, and it is the try to understand Ukrainians as a nation and Ukraine as a separate state, even before it was the matter of fact and before it was the truth in reality. Let me know what you think about the first episode of Ukraine, the History. If you know this book, let me know which parts of it you want to read together, because it is actually, you can find its reading in Ukrainian made by other people, and you can follow it in Ukrainian language, but this two sides translation, reading in Ukrainian and having the translation of the original book. It's not the translation, actually. Ukrainian is the translation made by Yuri Shevchuk, and which is not completely up to date according to present day ideas how we should do it. But it is good. It's very good for its time. Only the thing is on Ukraine now. Ukraini is something that disturbs me actually. And I'm reading the translation, Ukrainian translation, and I'm giving the original text in English. That's the difference from other sites or other YouTube pages. You can probably find the reading at. So let me know if you like the idea. Let me know which parts you want to read together. And maybe you have the same in your country, maybe in your country there were also some kind of a book dedicated to its history which changed the course of the further knowledges of further studies. I would be happy to know about it. I'm always interested in reading your comments. Also, don't forget about your likes, and if you can, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. That's how I can create more such videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to meet you very soon in our next episodes. Goodbye.